I'm really excited to introduce our guest. She comes all the way from Berlin to visit us on a few sort of journeys along the way through. So we're pretty excited to have her here along that journey. She's an architect and founder of the Tactile Architecture firm. Liz is an educator, theorist, researcher, and has worked as a practicing architect in various locations, and particularly in Germany, Russia, and the UK. To kind of go through a little bit of the formalities at the beginning, she studied at the Bartlett in London, got her Master's of Architecture from the Bartlett, received her Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Westminster, as well as attended RMIT, which is the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia. Currently, she's going through her doctorate program in Berlin at Humboldt University, which we might see glimpses of that today, possibly. And I'd like to kind of give a little bit of a synopsis before I let her take the stage. Her architectural research work, computationally based, investigates and synthesizes simulations of processes based upon self-organizations and agent-based formations. In particular, the work establishes a series of cybernetic strategies in order to transform our understanding of complex spatial and material scenarios. Furthermore, her work creatively, I believe, and quite creatively, inserts itself into various scalar focus modules, such as material behaviors, adaptive growth processes, along with, in an interesting way, along with urban interactive agents and surface populations. So I think the work can easily transform various scales quite successfully. Liz and I, just the other night, were briefly discussing the underutilized opportunities of data referencing and the often misunderstood descriptive techniques of transforming calculated data into genetic urban regrowth. And maybe we'll hear a little bit about that today, or maybe have a discussion after the lecture in terms of how data referencing can be implemented in a more productive sort of demonstration. But rather, we'll see how that sort of works itself out. But it's also, I think, really important to note before the lecture that it's important to note and understand that the work demonstrated by her research and design studios are not deterministic through pre-established formal logics. So it's a generation of processes rather than formal constructs. But rather, the work is a generative sequence of procedures, consequences, and adaptive solutions. Her teaching, Liz has been teaching for over 10 years in London, Nottingham, and currently at the DIA, the Dessau Institute of Architecture. Last year, she was awarded the George N. Pauley Fellow as a visiting professor at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where she continued her research focus in upper-level computational studios, in particular the studios entitled Codes in the Clouds, in a seminar entitled Architecture and Cybernetics, which I understand is where she began to merge the technical application of computation with the theoretical discourse, and beginning to blend the two sides of the story, I suppose. This work sets itself philosophically, positions itself by theories of earlier part of the 1920s up through to the 60s and beyond to contemporary issues. In terms of publications, Liz has just recently published, she was primary editor of the book entitled Encoding Architecture, and was just released this year, which I'm holding in my hand in a bit of a plug for Liz. I think it's an exceptional book of a series of works, and it should be available on Amazon quite soon, I believe. But in any case, The book comes from a longer conversation that was held as a symposium earlier this year, February of 2013 at Carnegie Mellon, with panelists such as Sanford Quinter, Sean Alquist, Neil Leach, and Wes McGee, which, if you don't know who those names are, I think you certainly should educate yourselves. Other papers and publications include Codes in the Clouds in 2011 and Codes in the Clouds number 3rd, 2012, as well as being involved with Neil Leach and Philip Yuan in Yangji University in Shanghai with a paper entitled Scripting the Future. So please help me welcome Liss Wermer.
I think I don't need to lecture anymore now. Thank you very much, Jeff. Yeah, that's wonderful. That was a great introduction. I couldn't have done that much better. Thank you. I'm totally delighted to be here, and yeah, that's right. I'm a little bit on a. Can you hear me properly? Yeah. I'm a little bit on a lecture tour from Venice Beach to Los Angeles downtown via here to MIT, and then back home to Berlin again. So in that sense, since I'm in the middle of my trip, I'm out of my jet lag and getting into the next one. So I should be in a good shape. And yeah, thank you very much for having me. Some of the things I've got in my talk were already mentioned, but I might just go through that again. And the way I do this talk tonight will be parts reading and parts just talking and doing a bit of free speech in the middle. So yeah, thanks Jeff for inviting me. Now, so Jeff's invitation came just in time, since it falls in the middle of the UCLA crits last week, and an invitation from Kellard's master course on parametricism and politics, where they wanted me to give a workshop for their students as preparation for a conference that took place last weekend in LA with great contributors such as Patrick Schumacher, Neil Leach, Benjamin Breton, and others. Apparently the talks of the Parametricism and Politics conference, as far as I know, can be also watched online. And the conference features Proust at MIT, which is this coming weekend, reviewing and discussing the Architecture Machine Group and the start of the MIT Media Lab. So this lecture here at TTU is the perfect timing and location to travel from the West Coast to the East Coast and back to Berlin. And of course, to position the topic I'm talking about in the current and contemporary debate on computational architecture and the role of the agency of architecture at the same time. In light of tonight's lecture, I want to ask the following questions. What is the legacy of architecture? How do we operate within architecture as a post-Fordist and still pre-bit discipline? What is the condition of architecture? And what is our role as architects in a post-network, but more so synthetically biological world of coupling? And I will come back to the term of coupling in relationship to what this is and how I do see this. Surely the answers may be discussed, however, since it is a global topic emerging and submerging in a large variety of disciplines and discussions, so not just architecture, also computer sciences and politics and economics, globally and locally, including politics and economics, cultural sciences, aesthetics and education. The answer tonight will be a debate, a discussion. And yes, I do have a very strong position in regards to where we are going. So this is very exciting. Raison Architecture by Le Corbusier, first published as a book in the original language as in French in 1923. The English translation followed in 1927. Lost in translation, and the issue of translation and language will be part of this talk tonight. Lost in translation got the title. The English title is, as you all know, Towards a New Architecture. But Le Corbusier was thinking towards a architecture. So this is a huge difference because he basically said there is no architecture. We need to go towards an architecture. And I feel that we are in a kind of similar position nowadays. An architecture that departs from the structures of the pompous and ornament-rich architectures found in Art Nouveau and the Baroque was Le Corbusier's attitude. And there's a good quote from Wiki. The polemical book contains 7 essays, all but one, which were published in the magazine L'Esprit Nouveau, beginning 1921. Each essay dismisses the contemporary trends of eclecticism and Art Deco, replacing them with architecture that was meant to be more than a stylistic experiment. And I do want to emphasize on the term stylistic, which in some of the conversations and debates on computational architecture is coming back with a particular term which is called parametricism, which I believe, and no, it's not a style, it's a technique. But we can talk about this later on. So I carry on with the quote, rather an architecture that would fundamentally change how humans interacted with buildings. This new mode of living derived from a new spirit, defining the industrial age, demanding a rebirth of architecture based on function and a new aesthetics based on pure form. End of quote. Le Corbusier was obsessed with the pure function, pure form, the application of pure technology for an architecture. Now, the interaction with buildings and the connection to Arthur C. Clarke, which is on the top. I mean, the picture on the top is in fact just a cutout of a photograph I took when I visited Harvard last April, I think. And the ones who've been there from you guys do know that they've got these different sort of signs saying what happened when, and they've got that in this amazing computer science technology museum thing, which is absolutely fascinating. So I did cut it off because underneath it's all about war and nuclear bombs and things like that, so I thought that's not part of the talk. But what I liked is 1945 science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke proposes the use of geostationary satellites for communication between distant locations. On Earth, apparently, it's cut off. So, in fact, maybe it should be cut off anyways, because on Earth is a bit obsolete by now, given that it was even before we stepped on the moon, or one of your fellows stepped on the moon first time. Who's familiar with Arthur C. Clarke? Very good, at least one. Okay, I come back to Arthur C. Clarke later on. Arthur C. Clarke proves to be one of the most important people when we talk about the theory and the philosophy of computational architecture and modern communication and media design. So now in 2013, we are in fact celebrating the 19th birthday of Le Corbusier's influential piece of architectural theory, Vers une architecture. Now in 2013, we also celebrate, which you guys should know, the 90th birthday of Texas Tech. As I found out prior to my visit here, so I did a little bit of homework. So now, even funny enough, when preparing this lecture, I went through the Gordon Pask archive, and Gordon Pask is one of my big idols, and you will find out later on why. Gordon Pask is a cybernetician, was a cybernetician, and I came across this photograph in the archive, which apparently is housed in the University of Vienna. I came across this photograph showing an envelope taken some probably 30 years ago, sent by this person, Chris Abel. I don't know if anybody in the audience knows who Chris Abel is. I tried to find out and I couldn't. But it seems as if this is Lubbock, Texas, sent to Gordon Pask. The weird thing is that there's a British stamp on it. So I don't know how that works, but however, there is some kind of connection. And I found a few more connections which I'm not going into at this occasion. So the world is very, very small, even over the course of decades. Curious that there is this British stamp. Okay, Gordon Pask, he's interesting for us because he was one of the people, actually he's between 1928 and 1996. He's one of the people who were highly interested in using computers not just as something that executes a particular task, but also using computers as learning devices. He was finally interested in the idea of computation as a learning device in itself, which means not necessarily using computers. And there's one project which is called the Fun Palace. The Fun Palace is basically I mean, you can look up the pictures. It looks quite simple. It's basically a scaffolding, and you've got people coming in and out, staying there, learning from each other's, observing each other's. So this structure seems to be like a huge central processing unit. So it is a kind of computational learning, but without computers. However, it should work in the same way. Also, this project was done together with Cedric Price. There's two others which you guys want to look up. One is the Colloquy of Mobiles, and the other one is Musicolor. Both of them deal with human-machine and human-computer interface and communication. So let me go back in time a little bit. So that's still my introduction. As I said, I did my homework. And I'm always very interested in where to contextualize the lecture in terms of who I face and where I am. That's got to do with my understanding of a cybernetic human being. So in August 1951, some strange closely related to the Bayesian architecture and Sir Arthur C. Clarke's vision happened at this very place where we are today, here and now. And I quote from Wiki again: "A V-shaped formation of lights was seen over the city. The Lubbock's Lights series of sightings received national publicity and is regarded as one of the first great UFO cases. The sightings were considered credibly because they were witnessed by several respected science professors at Texas Tech College and were photographed by a Texas Tech student. The photographs were reprinted nationwide in the newspaper and the Life magazine. Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's official study of the UFO mystery, did an extensive investigation on the Lubbock Lights. They concluded the photographs were not a hoax and showed genuine objects. However, they did dismiss the UFOs themselves as being either night-flying moths or a type of bird called plover. The Air Force argued that the underside of the plover or moths was reflected in the glow of Lubbock's new streetlights that night." End of quote. So that's a picture of these photographs that were taken. So whatever those objects were, from a formalist or behavioral point of view, the formation is clearly related to an architectural understanding utilizing tools that we find in computation, or I may rather say neurotational architecture, and the technology that creates such formations, biological and artificial. However, this is a crucial point. It is crucial to point out that architecture has been in the construction industry, and architectural thinking still has not accepted techniques and strategies already developed in the 1950s and later at MIT Architecture Machine Group, and also in the 1970s. The concept of semiosphere, which I want to talk about tonight, was not established at that time, but certainly a concept that aimed to explain the relevance of relationships over the relevance of discreteness in geometry, sociology, and economics. So, as you know, Jeff's firm is called Hayaseti, and he's got this amazing quote. I mean, Hayaseti means like thisness, and it's not to be confused with Heidegger's thingness. But there's this great quote on Jeff's website: as architects, it is imperative that we begin working and thinking of buildings not as independent entities, but as a series of ephemeral embedded organisms living amongst a natural ecological world, end of quote. So that goes hand in hand with the sentence I coined for the conference that Jeff was referring to. The architect is no longer a designer of discrete objects, matter and space, but a designer of systems with multi-layered components and complex relationships. In this occasion, I do want to refer to Stan Allen's discussion on the concept of field conditions in the 1990s. Also, the idea and the execution of Bernard Tschumi's Parc de la Villette, which works as a field, but only spatially, physically, and three-dimensionally, which certainly is not enough. And the last weekend during the conference, The Politics of Hermeticism, that became very apparent. that it's not just those 2 or 3 dimensions, that this clear field is not merely a 2-dimensional area or space, reminiscent of Descartes' discovery of the coordinate system, but a space whose multi-layered components and complex relationships do go far beyond the material, quantitative, tangible, the new field, or let's call it the para field. Para as above, beyond, beside, along. And also don't confuse para with meta. Meta is more like a regulation device. So we are in a cloud beyond a network society towards a paradigm of operations, practices, and behavior. So the architect is no longer a designer of discrete objects, matter and space, but a designer of systems with multi-layered components and complex relationships, was one of the first sentences and the agenda for the conference. Within the conference, we discussed the various current streams one can observe globally these days, relating to some of the geometric optimizations, material morphology, industrial robots and architecture, and so on. The book just came out. On the left-hand side, this is one project by Akim Menges, who did his PhD, a project by Jean Alquist, who did his PhD with Akim Menges at the ICD in Stuttgart, who is at the moment in Michigan. So if you guys have the chance to go to the Robots and Architecture Conference in February 2014 in Michigan, I highly recommend to do that, because you can meet these very interesting people. Now, coming back to this question of form and interaction, human-machine interaction, and advanced digital fabrication methods, and also one of the big questions in architecture, which is that of form finding. These are 2 images that come from the conference, and on the left-hand side, this is a project by 2 students from IAC, which is the Institute of Architecture, of Advanced Architecture in Catalonia in Barcelona. And they're dealing with magnetic material. So they're dealing with magnetic material, but they're also dealing with how can they use a robot to help or to assist in the design process. So this is part of a robot in a way. It's a little bit hard to see, but you've got 2 arms which hold this magnetic material, and they move around in a particular fashion. And what happens then is the designer, as in the architect, start adding material to the toolpath as such, which then creates a structure. And by magnetic material having a behavior, obviously a very strong behavior in itself, you do end up with a formation which is fairly mathematical, fairly rational, but irrationalized due to the toolpath of the actual magnets that hold it. Then again, what you see in the surface topology, which I find highly interesting from an architecture theory point of view, is a sort of fractal behavior, which is logical because the shavings are all the same size. There's only plus and minus, so the surface is very much a bit like, I think you did this project with these little spiky things, which you showed me upstairs, and it's a little bit like that. So you've got one algorithm, and it works in a fractal behavior. So fractals you should definitely look into. Benoit Mandelbrot is the keyword here. On the right-hand side, this is a photograph from the talk these 2 guys gave. This is Pierpaolo Rutico and his colleague, and they were working on a very different way of using human-machine interface. They were working on interactive building envelope, but they had a very clear form in mind. So there's a big difference, and I think that also has to do with top-down and bottom-up working in a way. So do you have a particular form in mind and you just want to optimize it like that, or do you let the material teach you and tell you how it wants to behave? Okay, power architecture contingency. As you know, the design studio I'm running is called Codes in the Clouds. This image derives from a Codes in the Cloud studio number 3, which was called Para-Architecture Contingency. And we were invited by Tom Kovac from RMIT to take part at the Maribor Urban, not competition, but investigation. Maribor was the European Capital of Culture in 2012. And Tom put together a great platform, I would say, and he invited about 80 or so professors, instructors to join this project and to look into what Maribor could be and do, and how we as cutting-edge thinkers, I would say, can deal with that and use tools. So this is just one image of a project that one of my students did, which also was exhibited at the Biennale in Venice, and it's called Stigmergic Scape. The Stigmergic Scape, on one hand, suggests or derives from a design strategy that is algorithmic on one hand, but on the other hand, it also suggests a particular recursiveness in not just geometry, but also in cultural behavior. It suggests a future conception of space as difference reality, where the boundary of virtual and physical blend. It describes an argument to construct and rethink architectural spatial logic. Future residential and economic concerns are focused on to define the cityscape as a generic growth pattern. Activities are analyzed within the existing industrial area and formulated as connecting network of nodes, eventually turning into a series of fluid potential spaces. So the idea of the Maribor urbanism is based on a new conception of space and living in future as difference reality. Multi-layered networks as activities, areas, are generated as self-organizing entities based on rules and information of programmatic concerns. So this is how he started in the very first place. Like we are living as organisms, or architecture works as organism, at least in our understanding, there needs to be a fluidity between the different programs. So that was one of the images that we received from this particular project. So the question is, where we as architects are required to work in the near and far future, as I mentioned before. And I may suggest that it is not necessarily the building industry, but rather we may act as these creatures who are able to comprehend complexity and are also able to understand models of those complexities and for those complexities. So the issue of model is super, super important. Reference to Darcy Thompson. Here I'm thinking of designing systems for quick and economical disaster relief. Keyword here is Katrina or Sandy, or the Philippines now, as well as dealing intelligently and humanitarian with informal settlements on one hand, but also, and this may be more relevant for architects, to operate within the field of communication, design, management, economics, marketing, and politics, because if you as architects think you are free in doing what you're doing, that's a big misbelief. And if you think you can change something in terms of politics, that's probably a big misbelief as well, unless you go into politics, because basically what you do is following what your client wants. Otherwise, they find a different architect. Now, the current debate on designing protocols, tools, definitions, and models for architectural design strategies and thinking, and of course education and pedagogy, is at its high point and intrinsically embedded in the new work produced globally, which apparently very often looks very similar. Tools for architecture are not merely new software applications ranging from building information modeling to visual systemics in Grasshopper, biophysics engines, Kangaroo, Toxiclips, or scripting, as we do at DIA, mainly with processing. Tools for architecture are mainly and foremost how we understand the new instruments and how we embed them into architecture as, on one hand, cultural technique, and on the other, architecture as a protocol in itself for optimizing the rational world, e.g. geometry, infrastructure, and so on. So the question of sustainability is again an extension of the two above, saying that sustainability may not be understood as having a LEED certificate or solar cells or a super insulated wall. Sustainability goes slightly beyond that. Okay, now I thought it would be interesting to talk about a little bit also how we understand architecture in the cultural realm, and how we define those protocols and how we see architecture as being digital or not digital or modern or whatever. So I'm going to show you 3 pictures here. I think it's scary. You might perceive that differently just because of cultural reasons. On the right-hand side, we've got the Stadtschloss from Karl Friedrich Schinkel and Andreas Schlüter from 1443 to 1451. That was when it was built, so it's quite a while ago. In the Second World War, on the same site, the GDR, as in the East German government, together with the Russians, tore it down after it was bombed anyways. And they put on the very same place the Palast der Republik, which is the Palace of the Republic of the GDR, under Erich Honecker, who was basically running the country. So that was the Palast der Republik for about 30 years. So what happened after that? It was torn down because of asbestos and other problems, and also I would claim political reasons. And we had a debate, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen on this site? So what was decided is to copy this thing and put it into the 21st century, okay? So that's a nice idea, but I have a few problems with that when I look into how architecture should also maybe serve as a agency for cultural development. So I leave this up to you, but in terms of, isn't there something missing in how we see the world when we do things like that? So I just want to put this in, and again with the sentence of Version Architecture. So is this Version Architecture, or shouldn't we go a little bit further and define the Stadtschloss for the 21st century? Okay, now the context, you're pretty much familiar with that now. Now, working in architecture in the 21st century, where the virtual and material reality merge and construction drawings take on the form of code, architecture targets the development of its expertise as the understanding and description of structures and forms as systems, living and non-living, virtual and material. Architecture is defined as coded, self-organizing organism. This all relates back to Aristotle, Plato, Descartes, Brunelleschi, Helmholtz, Darcy Thompson, Cedric Price, Nicholas Negroponte, and a few more, a reflection that concerns form in capital letters and the result of information or data in a variety of levels. So the Semiosphere and Neurotecture, the Causation of Architecture, that's a title that derived from one of my papers that hints towards understanding the current human condition. Prosthetics as inclusion of computing abilities and an understanding which on one hand might be more complex but actually closer to our native human makeup, and suggests a design strategy described as neurotecture. And another talk which was called The Architecture of Architecture. So A from those papers and B from the concept of semiosphere. The concept of semiosphere in architecture will be introduced via 2 different lenses. One is a technical one, investigating how the use of open source internet and new technologies influences the ways of decision making and design strategies. So that's the technical bit. And the second one, the lens of architecture as cultural technique and cultural sciences. As I'm a strong believer that architecture is part of the cultural technique. So in parallel, throughout the lecture, the conclusion of the subject matter vibrates in parallel with what I call neurotecture, a combination of palimpsest, superimposition, and intertwined fabrics of information in constant flux and reformation, a construct based on a second and third order cybernetics, or the architecture of architecture. What we see here is 2 images being slightly similar in the formal aspect. On the left-hand side, and that is interesting because that's like one of the first data-driven models that we have in computation. That's a project called SIMTA, and it was developed in 1976 in Japan, dealing with the infrastructure of Japan. So the idea was to find out how can we improve and optimize the infrastructure from what it was to what it should be using the intelligence, well, not really the intelligence, but using computers as a tool. So you do have this growing network over the island. On the right-hand side, these are several iterations of the growth of the network within the human brain, doing a very similar thing, trying to grow synapses and networks. And the most important thing that you guys want to remember, especially when you work not just in computational architecture, but that doesn't mean you use computers, it can be analog, just thinking, computational thinking. It's about the relationships. It's not about the things in themselves, because if you do have, let's say, an apple and a pear, and you don't know how to relate them to each other, they don't mean anything. But if you realize that you can make a super yummy juice with them, then you have a relationship, and that makes it. I always give food examples. I could give you one with a hot dog and sausage as well, but I'm not doing that. Okay, now semiosphere. Just to go through this, I mean, this is obviously the most important slide here. The term semiosphere was coined by somebody called Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman in his famous essay on the semiosphere. It was first published in 1984 in a journal which was called Science and Systems Studies, and it was translated into the English language only by 2005. Now, there are some definitions of semiosphere. I'm just going to read through some of them. Semiosphere is anything formed from the endless web of interpretations. The concept of space appears to describe an important aspect of the semiosphere, e.g. semiosphere is the space of meaning generation. We have one more. Unlike the physical world, which manifests a single truth for reality, semiosphere is the world of multiple truths, of multiple worlds. And I think that's very important for architects, because you might have a particular understanding of something, like I showed with the 3 different castles of Berlin, and somebody else might not. Somebody might see it politically and you might not. And Delanda has this wonderful example of how you can see a knife. You can see it as a weapon when you use it as a weapon, or you can see it just as a knife. Right. The ensemble of semiotic formations functionally precedes the singular isolated language and becomes a condition for the existence of the letter. Without the semiosphere, language not only does not function, and language, what I mean here, could also be code, or it could be a construction drawing. Okay. It doesn't exist. The division between the core and the periphery is a law of the internal organization of the semiosphere. Now, you can look at this in a very, very literal sense and talk about the internal configuration, for instance, of an architecture school and its periphery. So there is a particular behavior within it, and there's a periphery, and you don't have to, but you can pass this boundary. And this boundary is full of filters, as you know, and it's a transcending kind of area. There exists a boundary between the semiosphere and non-extrasemiotic space that surrounds it. Filters, bilingual, translatable, and so on. The levels of the semiosphere comprises an interconnected group of semiospheres, each of them being simultaneously both participant in the dialogue and the space of the dialogue. So what that means, essentially, when we talk about code, or DNA, we talk about a material that has its behavior embedded in it, at least with organic, non-living material. It works slightly differently with human beings or also animals, because they can learn and change. But the relevant thing to understand here is that there's a series of agents working with each other, working next to each other, having a particular behavior and being able to adjust to certain environments in order to communicate or not communicate. This is Johnny Mnemonic on the left-hand side, and does anybody know Johnny Mnemonic? Johnny Mnemonic, okay. Johnny Mnemonic, 1995, is based on William Gibson's Burning Frame movie, Burning Frame essay, book, 1986. Now, Johnny Mnemonic, he's a data trafficker, in fact. So what happens is he gets more or less transferred into cyberspace, which is a space full of lines and graphics, and a little bit like in Tron, I mean the original Tron by Walt Disney. And he gets basically reprogrammed. He underwent cybernetic surgery to have a data storage device which receives data. He has no access to this data. This data is locked with some kind of code word that only the recipient can open. So he is in this very crazy state of traveling through cyberspace, or what we call cyberspace, at the same time getting inserted with some kind of material that he puts from one place to another, which then gets released. His whole body and his whole function and his whole personality are changed by this activity. Now, the architecture machine group, on the other hand, which is on the right-hand side, Negroponte and guys in MIT, the interest in sensing and effecting, that's what they said, and that's a quote from Computer Aids to Design and Architecture. The interest in sensing and effecting a physical environment such that a machine could solicit information on its own was captured in a toy tank with photocells and bumpers, a far cry from the workings of the real human interface. So they started building a computer out of things, because there were no boxes for computers already made. And they were trying to design a shared space where they could share all sorts of information on one platform, which is like a cloud. So these two things together, I think, make an interesting combination. So since the late 1980s, we have grown extensions of our minds beyond the individual body and brain in a physical environment, transformed into binary language and overlapping simultaneous worlds, providing input from remote locations and the internet through numerous inputs by an accumulation and information produced by grey matter around the globe so far. There's an interesting book I can recommend here, which is called Michael Benedict's Cyberspace, First Steps. I'm not sure if you have it in the library, because most libraries don't have it, because it's a bit hard to get, but if you do get it, it would be great. Okay, now I think I had to show you a little bit of Rainer Bannon's Los Angeles.
Bushy, bushy blonde hair, serving USA.
There's just no other feeling in the world that compares with taking off in a clean 7-foot wave, crouching down and feeling the force of the wave just spraying your back as you come firing out. It's just the greatest thing in the world, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Coming up now on your right is the world's biggest toy and game factory. From here, Matt Mason's space toys, Hot Wheels cars, and Barbie dolls go to all parts of the free world. You'll be making a long, smooth sweep over the high curving ramp against the sky. How about that? Isn't it the only way to go? Back to Earth again. Get you back.
From up here, you have this fantastic view of the whole enormous city of Los Angeles. On a clear day, endless streets running away for miles and miles and miles to what looks like just plain, endless, boring American suburbia. But when you look into it more closely, then you realize it's really a very different kind of place. The more you look into the layout of the city, the more you see that it consists increasingly of long lines of tall business towers threaded through a sea of little houses. The classic is Wilshire Boulevard, where only a line of parking lots separates the business street from the residential suburbia immediately behind it.
Never all problems. There are some beautiful things here too. These are the famous Watts Towers, a do-it-yourself monument to man's craving for beauty, executed over a period of 33 years by Simon Rodia, an untutored genius from Rome, Italy. Enjoy your visit now. Switch off when you hear the tone.
And I'd bring any visitor here myself too, and before I showed him anything else usually. So, something like 1 million Angelenos could say something you'd never expect to hear them say. I live within walking distance of my work. But strangely, you have to explain this to Angelenos, as I often find myself doing at University of Southern California. High style. Just look at the paintwork on these vans.
Okay. So Rainer Banham loves Los Angeles, investigates the urban and domestic built environment as a combination of things, and I think that's something we have to keep in mind. And it provides obviously a cultural understanding of the evolution of architecture. Now, what he could not do at that time, but what we can do now, is mapping behavior in a particular way. Mapping behavior, understanding behavioral rules, which becomes more and more relevant using big data. On an urban level, through mapping the movement in conjunction with unemployment, economy, account of childbirth, and so on. And data that you can receive through open data sources, like Pittsburgh, for instance, has that. I suppose Los Angeles has that as well. So what we want to do is we do want to see the city and the form of the city in regards to form being a verb and not a noun. So this is just a very, very tiny, simple processing sketch, working not even with parametrics, but working with just a little algorithm that gives you a basic understanding of how to regulate things or how to program things. So in this particular case, you do have one source which extracts agents, and once they are apart in a particular distance, they lose each other's and they find somebody else who's in a particular periphery. So this is a very, very simple algorithm, not dissimilar to swarming and flocking, but it creates that form is basically not a top-down thing that you do want to create, but it's something that results from an algorithm. And this goes hand in hand with a different understanding of architecture than the modernist approach in the 1920th century. So generative design describes a system or model relationship rather than an object-model relationship. There's also a lovely, wonderful lecture by Delanda, which is called Genetic Algorithm. It's a pretty old lecture, but it's very good. He does explain things very well. However, we are beyond the genetic algorithm. We are at an algorithm that also deals with parametrics. We are working with parameters, algorithms, self-organization, multi-agent systems, clustering, branching, packaging, populating, processing, emergence, cellular automata, fractals, stigmergy, autopoiesis, and so on. So what started in the 1960s now finally approaches the architecture of today as an architecture of lushness, which is following a period of abstinences. Abstinence of mathematics, for instance, abstinence of clarity or abstinence of pattern, abstinence of heterogeneity, passion or indulgence. Architecture is not a profession, architecture is a life, or better, a lifestyle. So we have created a semiosphere between the virtual and the real. Let me just go through. This one, for instance, is a reference to how we produce these days. I mean, there's some of you guys might have seen that before. That's images showing 2012 work, I think, from Iris van Herpen. She's a fashion designer. She also works together with Nicolo Casas, who's an architect. And they use algorithms and algorithmic design strategies and scripting for creating 3D objects that can be worn on the human body. What is happening here, there is a clear, very, very clear formula, I think, similar approach to, for instance, Calatrava's work. But also what can be seen is that within the architectural profession, you don't necessarily talk to a builder anymore, but you print your stuff yourself. So that changes a whole lot from being an architect who creates a formal thing or a BIM model or something like that to somebody who really wants to understand material behavior as well. And you need to have different consultants. You may want to work together with computer scientists and ergonomic doctors rather than people who do bricklaying. I don't know if you guys do bricklaying here, but in Germany we do a lot of bricklaying. Like this is, you guys know this building, that's like one of probably the first parametric building. I mean, that's not the building, that's the model of it, or the model for the design strategy. That's a chain model working with gravity. Antonio Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, which was recently finished by Mark Burry for RMIT. And this building is based on two parameters. One is gravity, which is a parameter that we cannot change on Earth, and the other one is hyperboloids. And I highly recommend to investigate into how this has been renovated or restored. Now, the other issue in terms of when you work with, in this realm of physical, digital, computational, and material, and cultural, like this is two images which deal mainly, on one hand, with the typology of the column in a space, but on the other hand, with a technical instrument, and that's subdivision. I mean, you all know subdivision from, using Grasshopper or Maya or whatever. You subdivide your surfaces in order to make them smoother, for instance. Michael Hansmeier, German architect, he uses it in a different way. He uses subdivision for creating a surface topography, which I find highly interesting. And the image on the right-hand side is, in fact, a one-to-one model made of paper. Using subdivision and layering. So there is a question of ornament, pattern, formalism, and obviously utilitas and firmitas and Schönheit wäre das letzte, the beauty. Okay, I want to go to something else actually. I talk a little bit about, okay. Now, starting with Gaudi, and I skipped these slides, but looking at Darcy Thompson, for instance, on growth and form. Darcy Thompson says any form is a diagram of forces within space we may regard as the system being totally open, mainly because there's no environment as such. Forces derive from the agents themselves. Generally, the system is stable. However, perturbations such as space storms do occur, as do slight imperfections in rotational movements. Collisions may happen. Variables are interconnected, therefore no discrete movement is possible. Now this is a video, like on the left-hand side, you do see the emergence of a particular form, like on this side, by Frei Otto. Some of you might have seen that. That deals with, that's a string model, or actually it's a model of a string model dealing with the reconfiguration of space. And what happens here, you do have a string model which is fairly accurate, and you add humidity, and due to the behavior, the internal behavior of the material, the strings do cling to each other. On the other side, you've got a model that deals with multi-agent systems, and it works with a random walk algorithm on one hand. On the other hand, it acts, or it aims at creating a three-dimensional network, which in fact is based on natural behavior. So that's Gordon-Pask. Gordon-Pask, as I said, semiosphere, penetration, filtering, and transformation, and it deals with the distinction between the inside and the outside. Now, Gordon-Pask was doing this in the 80s at the AA. He's working on machines that do learning together with architects. Okay, so what we have to find out is where do we act? Paradigms of operations, practices, and behavior. And I think that was started already in the evolutionary architecture with John Fraser and the cyberspace in Neuromancer. Can you see that? Okay. That's a project that starts to work with issues of how computation can help to build up spaces. So that's very, very early stage. But what we did here is looking at an existing structure, which is actually not in this model, just to make sure that we see the model by itself, and starting to build up this particular work, this particular structure with parameters such as gravity, also wind forces. That's been done in processing, and it aimed at an arching and vaulting structure, just mainly because it is one of the most stable structures. And the whole background of this project was to figure out if there is an option to not rejuvenate, but rebuild parts of cities which are deteriorating, such as Venice. So this is a part of a Venice research. So what happens if you do have, for instance, cyber robots that are able, tiny little micro robots that are able to harvest material that's being deteriorating, reconfiguring it in its behavior, and re-putting it or reconstructing the buildings which are there in a different kind of matter. This is a project which deals with the similar thing, but I do want to show something else. What I do want to show with these images is in this semiospheric space between thinking, making, programming, and decision making, and also the role of the architect. You do start with some kind of point cloud, which also derives from processing here. You go through a series of iterations and a genealogy of what you're doing and what you're aiming at. At one point you may arrive somewhere where you think, how the heck do I make this thing to material? And then you go into maybe a different software and start meshing. Very often between the meshing process and through the meshing process, things happen that change your first concept or goal. So this particular piece had several iterations of meshing. At the end of the day, we decided on which suited the project best in our understanding, but obviously there's no evaluation criteria at this moment in time. Okay. I'm skipping through some stuff here. That was actually last week in UCLA. So these guys, I'm showing this because you've got this new robot, and I think you might be interested in that. So these guys have these two robots, and what they do is they're trying to understand and script space through the robots observing each other's. So one of them has a slide projector, and the other one has the canvas. So on the top left-hand side, you see the feedback from the slide projector in terms of the coordinates of where these robots moved and what they did. So the question is, how can you describe space by using robotic configurations? This is all research, so there's no sort of application that wants to come out there at this moment in time, which we could regard as build architecture. But it's something that we architects want to get engaged with. Okay, I think I'm gonna just do this one. Scripting culture. Now, the scripting culture deals with things like genotype and phenotype. I don't know how many of you guys are using processing, but certainly some of you use Grasshopper and you work in forums and so on. And the way it works is like, if you do have a serious problem, you may actually send your code into a forum and find advice from people all over the world. So through that process, which is like a mutation process, your initial genotypical code may be changed into some phenotypical code through various parameters. So the question here is, where is this space where you as architects actually operate in as designers? And I would also want to claim that this is a particular space where semiospheres come together and work in a mobile-like construction. So we are beyond this, which is the assembly line of Fort in Michigan, 1914, which was already replaced in 1950s for numerical control. And we are going towards this. Collective design intelligence must not be understood as phenomenon or operator, but as an activity, as a process of form. So I'm not Vitruvian man. I am not a Vitruvian man enclosed within a single perfect circle, looking out at the world from my personal perspective coordinates and simultaneously providing the measure of all things, nor am I, as architectural phenomenologists would have it, an autonomous, self-sufficient biological embodied subject encountering, objectifying, and responding to my immediate environment. I construct and I am constructed in a mutually recursive process that continually engages my fluid, permeable boundaries and my endlessly ramifying networks. I'm a spatially extended cyborg. That's a quote from Me++, William Mitchell in Cyborg and the Self. Is that nice? Okay. Now this is an image which also derived from this Venice project, where this particular student was looking into how things technically work in terms of how can you insert paths within the city, also using processing and trying to understand particular spatial configurations. And I've got two more slides. One is the architecture of architecture as a survival strategy. obeying to the fact that the change of atoms to bits is irrevocable and unstoppable from being digital. 1994, Nicholas Negroponte. I've got tons of slides in between, but I'm not going to show you these now because I think it's going to be too much. Nicholas Negroponte is one of the MIT Machine Group guys, and this is a very, very interesting book which goes hand in hand with Catherine Hale's post-humanism book. And I would also claim that it goes hand in hand with what we see here on the left-hand side. That's just a fractal behavior, a very simple two-dimensional fractal behavior, which you guys are familiar with. On the other side, that's again Iris von Herpen. It's not the same pattern between these two. It's not the same geometry, but there's it's clearly visible that you do have a fractal behavior of the pattern that Iris uses on either side and the front of this collar, which is in fact made of silicon. So here we are going in a very, very interesting realm where the material and the geometry are not static anymore by themselves anyways, but they become even less static when they are attached or a part of a different system. I mean, here we don't have an interchange or interconnection or interactivity between the piece and the human body, but we know that in sports and athletics, we do have that particular smart materials will tell the athlete that he has to drink more or whatsoever. So I do want to conclude with these two images because I just love that contrast and homogeneity on the other hand from the fractal behavior that that we've known for a very long time, and the very new work by Iris. And unfortunately I have to show fashion and not architecture because architecture usually takes at least 100 years longer than everything else. So thank you very much. I could have another hour, but I'm not doing that.
Questions?
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you very much for a great lecture.
You're welcome.
My question is about form. And you mentioned that form should not be an noun, but a verb. For myself, I tend to agree with that. But one thing that I have been asked, I have my own answers to that. I'm just curious to know what your answer would be. Is form as in the looks of what we will have in the manifestation of what you presented as architecture? Because we will have fractal behaviors, we will have whatever that we will have will look very much like biometry. And the look, the organic look, the no straight line look is something that not everybody is used to. And there is a lot of fear that we are losing a lot of tradition. And if we go towards this kind of architecture, this kind of thinking, is there an answer to that? To justify?
I don't think there's an answer to that, and I think it's good that there is no answer to things because we do live in a multidimensional world and we come from different backgrounds. I don't think that we are losing tradition. What I want to say, what I'm trying to convey to most colleagues and students alike, really, is that it is more like an evolution and it's a genealogy. And when I look back at Goethe's ideas of the wall and the Wand, the Gewand, which is like a German word and it means clothing or coat. Gewand and Wand, etymologically it's the same word. That's got to do with a performance of one thing performing shelter. So, which in my opinion also is a kind of similarity So, which also is a biological thing. So you've got a skin and you've got a gewand, like a clothing, and you've got a wall, which is your shelter. So I think it's more about that we are carrying these things on. And also other examples, which are probably more clear, is how traditionally tents are being built, which is minimal surface structure. And also when you look at ancient people, I can't really say that, but other cultures who deal with their climatic environment more intelligently than we in Western cultures, they've got the hub in the middle, and they've got an outlet in the center of the space, so you've got a natural ventilation, which is the same like termite hills, for instance. So I don't think we do lose tradition. The very important thing is that we do understand where we're coming from. And I have to say, I totally disrespect this kind of architecture I'm proposing without considering where it's coming from. So, because then it's not playing with shapes, then it's playing with code. And what's the difference? Yeah, so, and I think form is super important. And if an artist says, I do like this thing because it's got a beautiful form, that's okay with me, but still I would like to propose that form should be the result of internal and external forces. And that is something that Darcy Thompson in 1917 fleshed out in his book On Growth and Form, which I do recommend everybody reading. It's almost 100 years old, and architects are still thinking that they are the master of form, and optimization works better through regulations than through looking at the environmental influences. So I hope that answers your question.
So I really appreciate that you assess parametricism not as a formal methodology, but as a kind of technique that's used, or as an actual methodology of thinking or about processing these networks or relationships, rather than just a formal answer. I guess my question would be, when thinking about these data or code networks, how do we as architects start to assess the value in the parameters?
Good question.
Or assess what relationships are prioritized within that code to signify our role or our position, I guess, I suppose, in the result. Because I totally believe that form should be a resultant, but how do you start to assess that?
That's exactly the right question, and that's the question that we all ask at the moment. First of all, I just want to say there's a difference between parametrics and parametricism. So I'm talking about parametrics, actually. And this is a really good question, and that's a serious problem, because at the moment we don't have evaluation criteria. We are luckily beyond, no, that I can't say it like that, because that would be wrong. But it used to be digital architecture. Okay, but digital is something that derived in the early 1920s through the digital computer. Okay, but we're talking computational. So we talked about digital architecture with Greg Lynn starting with the blob and so on and so on. And then we looked into smooth and striated with Liss from a philosophical point of view. That was sort of in the 90s and early 2000s. And now we are a little bit further, that we can say, well, we don't just manipulate shapes, but we can actually insert some behavior. And the answer to your question, I think, cannot be given, probably not in the next 50 years, because we don't know what to do with this thing, with this creature that we invented. So I have no answer to this question, but this is a pressing question, and we do need to make sure that we have some answers to that. But I want to also extend this question and be very critical towards the evaluation criteria that we are using at the moment. And I would like to give this example, which I mentioned to Dustin earlier. Like in Europe, or probably especially in Germany, we're not really used to air condition, and Now, staying in a hotel where I can't open a window, not even 5 centimeter, makes me really claustrophobic. I mean, it's very, very difficult. And also from an architectural point of view, and I think that's more important with this example, there's an impermeable boundary between the exterior and me. And I find that very, very difficult. So is the evaluation criteria of being completely hermetically divided from your exterior or different world, is that really still a good thing or not? You know, so I think there is some evaluation criteria which we may want to review. Also, this great freedom of, you know, having a car, driving around. I mean, that's fantastic. But is this evaluation criteria still valid in well, a space or a world, I would say, where infrastructure can be done differently? So I think we have to question this whole thing. And I mean, you guys are the generation that may not answer it, but you're in there. I mean, you're in the luckiest position ever. I mean, we are very lucky because we grew up with rapidographs and we learned the computer later on. You guys have no idea of what a rapidograph is. I don't know if that's a good thing, but what I want to say is you've got an understanding of this computational world, and you do 60 things at the same time with your computer. And so the stage is yours. Yeah, great question, and I would love to carry on this. I mean, this is the debate that's happening all over the world. Yeah.
I think you have a good statement out there because you say the quote from Negroponte that we are somewhere on the change from the atom to the bit, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the question of evaluation refers on the one hand to the bit. Mm-hmm. Because if you only stay with the digital read-on, it's basically nothing has changed since the 90s.
Totally.
Evaluation of form,
totally.
Shape, because even further down the road, you can do any type of shape, any type of form, and you don't really know which one to choose.
Correct.
So you're at the level of the machining that we defined in the 90s. So you have a process, and nobody knows when to stop it. It just freezes, and in the 90s became a digital rendering. Right? And you showed us some of those, right? So there's some kind of, it doesn't matter if it's processing or anything else, you at one point stop it arbitrarily, and you make an argument you can have a certain performance at this point in time or not. And you can add something more perimeters to it. Now, Negroponte was maybe at that time ahead of us because he was talking about atoms. Right? Now, today we know that we are at the level where we can actually define materials, the geometry of materials and the bits of materials, and such understand what the properties are of materials. Mm-hmm. So unless I do not link the bits with the atom, I can't evaluate. But once I do, I can start to evaluate. So the point actually is, I think we do have an answer. We just, at the moment, we have to develop the right sustained process of linking the atom with the bit. And also, I think on the question of form that you were discussing is, I think there is probably, we don't know maybe enough, but there is form out there which you would refer to in the biological read-on, that everything that's around us, it's from glass, it's from concrete, it's from steel, it has a form. It's given because it has a performance and a property. Once you look at it on a nano level, you suddenly understand that there's a certain geometry in there that actually makes it perform. And it is evaluated upon that geometry. Now, I don't know what your question is. I'm just saying we have to learn to probably know more about materials any level. And that will hopefully allow us to then project onto a digital level where the bits actually sit that we objects actually know how to play with. Yeah?
Do you mean the atoms? The
What the performance of materials are.
Yeah.
Right?
I totally agree with that.
That's a super exciting paradigm. Right? And I think some of the images really show where we're relating to that in some way, where there is this kind of architectural experimentation of materials that is somehow reconciling by a digital geometry, but we don't understand what the material does. And all the robotics paradigm is the same story.
Oh, we have absolutely no idea at the moment, but this is why I think it's so exciting to work on this. And I do definitely encourage, interdisciplinary work with the guys from the Robots Institute and the CS people, and it's going to be very, very exciting in the future. And you're absolutely right, and I mean, I have the chance to see Nick Raponte next weekend at this conference in MIT, and these will be questions that will, come up at that conference, because it is about the architecture machine group then and what are we doing with it now. And the material thing is one part of it, but I'm also very intrigued by the infrastructural, and how do we deal with things like mass housing or informal settlements or things like Katrina and Sandy. I mean, come on, what happened after Katrina? I was really a little bit furious because you had these architects doing pink buildings. It's okay, I like pink, but I'm not entirely sure if that's the right approach. And we will be dealing with an incredible amount of increasing population in the world. And you guys might be dealing with issues like space stations. How do you design space stations for humans? And this is where Arthur C. Clarke comes into play, because there's a great book which is called Fountains to Paradise, which has to do with space station and material, because he's designing this space station which has a counterweight on the other side 40,000 miles away so that it stays in balance. And the material they're using, that was written I think end of the 70s, the material they're using is something that NASA is still working on and worked on at that time, is how to create a steel which is similar to spider silk. So this is incredible stuff, and everybody who works, on material sciences and architecture is fantastic. However, I want to encourage everybody not to forget that it's also something where we move around and behave, and it's emotional, and it's not all rational mathematics, and I think that's important also. So yeah, I think there's a subject for your conference. More comments, questions?
First, I'm kind of glad to this intriguing lectures, and what I have made a comment to the question about the evaluation assessment. And I was just wondering, because we are talking quite a different approach to the architecture. Evaluation also has to give quite a different versions. Obviously we not going to evaluate or assess the forms of it, but like you mentioned in earlier, like applying the relationship, prioritizing certain aspects. So that as that level, not in the form level, but constructing these systems as an object, like computer science means architecture of this system, right? Building up the system, how you building up and how you prioritizing, or how you actually applying the relationships to it, this becomes that's the point we need to assess and evaluate, rather than the ending, right?
Absolutely.
And
That's
it's a key continuing process, and that's the beauty about it. So my question back to you is, it's fascinating when it generates it, all of these interesting aspects. But architecture has this notion about some point we have to stop it and it becomes a form. So there's this kind of missing magic about that moment. When you keep generating animated reproducing it, changing it. It's such a beautiful form. And certainly it has a strong outcome. But on the other side, now you go back to the architect, someone, okay, we get started, and if you build something, then it loses all the magic. So what do you think about it?
I think that's a totally valid point, and I'm very happy that you touch upon this. There is, I mean, we are here in architecture education, so that's exactly the right question for architects. What do I do? Am I going to be like somebody who's, architecture, office fodder, and produce window schedules, or am I going to deal with architecture in a different way? And some of you guys might build up their own firms and do amazing things, and you're absolutely right, you have to start building, absolutely. But I think there's also actually the duty and the responsibility of an architect to work on a theoretical level, and that doesn't mean that you have to read the Liss and cybernetics and Plato and refer to the Politeia and the American government and try to make something better with architecture. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that architects, luckily, are in the position that we are allowed to and we are encouraged to look beyond and left and right. And that's fantastic. And I also like to say that, and that's what I'm actually really claiming, that an architect not necessarily anymore is somebody who, architects build not. They don't build for a start. Builders build, okay? Architects do diagrams and drawings and models, and builders build. Just physically, just to get this right. But they are part of the production process of a building. And I think that's very important. And I think all of you should work in an architect's office, definitely, and be on the building site and so on. But the interesting thing between the material and the non-material, like Tschumi's Parc de la Villette, this is where it becomes interesting in terms of the performance of the building. I don't know how many guys of you know Pessac. Pessac is a settlement 1923 until 1927, I think, Corbusier, somewhere in Marseille. And that was a settlement for factory workers. And Corbusier obviously likes white and square and so on, beautiful roof terraces, long strip windows. Now, he made a mistake because he didn't look at who's going to move in there. So the people who moved in there were simple factory workers, and they said, what should I do with the roof terrace? I can just cover it up and have a different room. I've got more room then. I can live there and sleep there and do something. And why the heck should I have all these windows, these strip windows? I need some space to put my cupboard or my whatever. So they boarded up strip windows. They totally changed. And this is what it's when I talk about mutations, for instance. We had these two systems coming together, the Corbusier beautiful white sugar cube building and the French factory worker, there were two organisms, more or less. So I think in that case, maybe Corbusier was a little bit too theoretical. However, beginning of the 2000s, Pessac was renovated, and apparently, like in the Unité d'Habitation, most of the people who live there are architects, of course, and they love it. Yes, totally. You have to differentiate between the academics and the theory of architecture and the crowd who's looking into Deleuze and Guattari and all the rest of it, and the ones who build. And I think that's good. And I love to have conversations with both. They are serious camps, and they fight. But But that's a very good comment, especially in the School of Architecture, where you guys want to produce architects who also work in offices and don't just do thinking.
I have a lot to say, but I guess you'll be able to. I guess it's another one of these comments, questions. Leslie or Leslie has a question, correct? I think there's sort of a two-part conversation occurring. One is about the processing of information of data, and then at what point do you, in my theory class, I call it baking, like we do in grasshoppers, or bake.
Yeah.
Comes out and there it is, it's not changing. I think maybe this is the question, is how do you consider these sort of simulations of natural systems performative on the evolution, generative evolution? Because like the example of the building in Berlin, I think it's a great example of the same story. It's like these things evolved in order to, that was basically a bad version of baking. Right? It's like they baked it in, and it's
They rebaked it, it's
they
even
rebaked
worse.
it, yeah. It's burnt now.
We call it French toast.
And I'm curious, maybe if you can comment on in your work, how you guys deal with the attitude about a continually evolving system.
Now, I want to, and that also relates to Christian's comment in a way. I want to just briefly introduce positive feedback and negative feedback. Have you heard of that? Okay. Positive feedback and negative feedback, and the term of the homeostat, which goes back to biology, which also deals with Maturana and Varela, mainly Maturana and the autopoiesis in biology. Now, the homeostat and negative feedback, these two things usually go together. Imagine you've got just the flush of a toilet, okay? So you've got a negative feedback in there. So the toilet flushes, la 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 la, and then you've got this piece which is like a regulator, and it tells the water to stop at one stage when it is on a particular level. So this is what very often happens in biology. You've got this natural regulator that puts an organism into a homeostatic, balanced, structural situation, configuration. And then you've got something which is called positive feedback, which is like, a tornado, or something that does not have a regulator. So if you didn't have this flush thing in this little cistern, that would be a bit messy in your apartment. The other one is the example of the thermostat, which is the prime example for first order cybernetics, which has to do with negative feedback. So you've got the thermostat, and the thermostat is there to turn on the heating when it's too cold. So then you have a sensor who's basically the regulator, and the regulator, he is the one, or she is the one, it is the one that controls that the process is still goal driven. Okay, so that's important for you guys. So you have a goal, you want to build a one-family house with 2 stories and a pitched roof. Okay, so this is your goal. As soon as somebody says, no, we don't want to have a pitched roof, you say, but you have to have a pitched roof. Why do I have to have a pitched roof? Because there's snow falling, it needs to run down. I mean, you don't have the snow problem here, but you know what I mean. So there's particular parameters which come into account that regulate the goal. So negative feedback is the controller. Positive feedback means it's a never-ending story. It's a continuum. And I'm talking on a meta system and saying tradition is something that has an evolution, and that's the continuum of architecture. And it's also, that's why this one is the causation of architecture. This is a serious problem, what you're just mentioning, in architectural design at the moment and form at the moment. Now this green thing, Nanas and Elizabeth. Where's Nana and Elizabeth? Here. Problem. Same problem. Where do you stop? So if you don't introduce something like a regulator, it carries on and carries on and carries on. But the question goes again back to what is this regulator? Now, what I've been lecturing actually in the last few years is the relevance to look into biology and to look into how this system works as a model. I'm not talking about biomimicry as such, but as a model. How can we learn from that? I'm not saying we have to copy this and we want to live in termite mountains and that sort of thing, but I think it helps us to understand how these self-organizing, growing, diffusion, limited aggregation models work. And that's also why I'm totally convinced that we need to work together with people in colloid and interface research, who in fact Max Planck Institute colloid and interface research, recruits architects because they know how to model these things in a beautiful way too. And also computer scientists because they know how to work with code. And yeah, so it's very exciting. Yeah, the problem is there. When do you stop the process? Usually you stop the process when the deadline approaches. Which is probably not the best criteria. Okay.
In a biological model, if you talk about a model, in a biological model, you have external constraints.
Absolutely.
And internal constraints. And that's why the system works so well. Because they know exactly if they're on a certain niche condition, right? The lifespan is somewhere established. There's predators, there's some other species that kind of affected. There's temperature, there's sunlight. And that's why they're actually perfectly optimized. Now the question is, in an architectural machine that kind of mimics those models, right? How much of that data can we actually implement into our systems? Right? So we go actually beyond the question of pure aesthetic or intuitive evaluation. And I'm not saying we have to go into complete performance-based model, right? But the experiment is the interesting one, where you have a certain amount of external data that actually conditions the system or your model you're actually setting up.
That's one guy to look into in that respect. Jakob von Uexküll, he was one of the first looking into the problem of internal, external, and the issue of Umwelt. I think Umwelt is also an American term. Is that right? Do you use it in the States? Umwelt, environment. I'm not sure. At least in the translations of Uexküll's work, the term Umwelt is used. He stressed that the individual organism is always actively creating its Umwelt. So there is an interaction between the external forces and the internal ones. And that also relates to the issue of genotype and phenotype. So you've got, one is the genotype, so you've got a little flower that grows only this high in the desert, but it might grow this high and have lots of flowers and things when it's in a different environment. I mean, it's about understanding these systems and models, but not necessarily taking them directly analog into a program. And this is where the crux lies as well. So lots to do, which is good.